The application sat on the desk like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Officer Kelvin Thra had reviewed thousands of transfer requests in his 40 cycles of service with the warriors, petitioning for quieter postings, veterans chasing glory, rookies overestimating their courage. He had seen ambition, desperation, stupidity, and every shade in between, but as his secondary appendages scrolled through the data slate in front of him, he felt something he hadn't felt behind that desk in years, genuine disbelief. He read it again, then a third time. Transfer request, Olivia Fletcher. Human Resources Division, Monster Division, effective immediately. A sound escaped him, something between a click and a wheeze, that his vocal synthesizer politely declined to translate. It was laughter, pure, uncontrolled, galactically undignified laughter. He looked up. She was already watching him. That was the first thing that unsettled him. Not that she was small, though she was, barely reaching the height of his desk if he'd stood beside her. Not that she was human, though that alone gave most species pause if they knew their history. What unsettled him was her stillness. She stood in front of his desk the way a sensor tower stands in a storm. Completely unmoved, completely present. Every piece of her attention aimed directly at him like a targeting system that had already locked on. Her name was printed at the top of the application. Olivia Fletcher, 28 years old by human reckoning, brown hair pulled back with the kind of efficiency that said she'd done it 10,000 times and stopped thinking about it. Dark eyes that didn't blink quite as often as they should have. "Let me make certain I understand what you're asking," Kelvin said slowly, setting the slate down with deliberate care. "You want to leave the Human Resources Department on where, I should note, you have an exceptional record in a very comfortable office, and join the Monster Division?" "Yes, sir." No hesitation. The two words landed like stones dropped into still water. Kelvin folded his upper appendages across his chest and regarded her. The Monster Division was not a metaphor. It was not a colorful nickname for a challenging assignment. It was the arm of the Galactic Security Corps responsible for hunting the most dangerous beings in the known universe. Some rogue Vraxian berserkers with the strength to crack starship hulls, Clandathy hive minds capable of coordinating planetary-scale devastation, Thoraxian apex predators who had been perfecting the art of the hunt for 10 millennia. The mortality rate in the first standard year alone was 43%. Some of the creatures they pursued could reshape matter at the molecular level. Some of them didn't even have a concept of mercy encoded into their biology, and across from him sat a woman whose greatest documented professional achievement was talking a Vraxian out of disemboweling a co-worker over a parking dispute. "Miss Fletcher," he tried to make his voice gentle, "what you're asking to do is statistically equivalent to requesting to be launched into a star. The Monster Division exists for elite hunters, Apex-class combatants, beings with natural weaponry or decades of tactical training. You have," he checked the file, "3 years of administrative experience, 0 weapons certifications, and no tactical record of any kind." "That's not entirely accurate, sir." He paused. "Excuse me? Before the Corps, I spent 6 years as an emergency dispatcher in Detroit." She said the city's name like it explained everything. When his expression remained blank, she continued. "Detroit is a city on Earth, one of the more intense ones. I handled domestic crises, active shooter events, hostage negotiations, all in real time. All under conditions where a wrong word could get someone killed. I learned to stay calm when the world is on fire. I learned to read situations faster than any algorithm, and to understand people. What they actually want versus what they say they want. And I learned something else." She leaned forward slightly. "The most dangerous monsters are rarely the ones with the biggest teeth." The amusement in Kelvin's chest dimmed. Something in her tone had changed. A coldness beneath the surface of her words. Like deep water under a thin sheet of ice. He'd heard bravado before. He knew the difference between a warrior performing confidence and something harder. Something that had been tested and hadn't broken. He wasn't sure which one this was. That bothered him. "You've read the incident reports," he said. "Not a question. Everyone I could access. I processed the casualty notifications. I've seen what the reports don't say. The pattern buried in the data. The hunters who die in the first year don't die because they lack strength or firepower. They die because they charge into situations their instincts weren't built for. The ones who survive and the ones who build real records. They're the ones who think, who adapt, who understand what they're hunting before they ever set foot in the same room with it." She sat back. "Humans improvise, sir. We adapt. We find solutions in situations that have no business having solutions. I'm not asking to be your strongest hunter. I'm asking to be your most useful one." Kelvin stared at her for a long moment. There was a reason his species and in most species in the known galaxy or had revised their threat assessments of humanity dramatically in the early years of contact. It wasn't the humans' technology, which had been primitive by galactic standards. It wasn't their physical capability, which was moderate at best. It was something harder to quantify and far more difficult to counter. Humans were persistence predators. They had evolved on a planet that tried to kill them in every conceivable way. And their response had been to simply refuse to stop. They didn't have venom. They didn't have armor. They didn't have claws worth mentioning. What they had was an absolute, almost pathological refusal to accept that something was impossible, combined with a talent for turning the environment against anything that threatened them. Across 40 cycles of service, Kelvin had learned to respect that. He had also learned deeply and from personal experience to be afraid of it. Fine, he said, and immediately wished he hadn't. The word came out before the rest of his brain could stop it. He cleared his throat and straightened, attempting to recover some authority. I'll approve the transfer, but I'm placing you with Team 17, lower priority assignments. If you last 6 months without getting killed or causing an incident that results in a formal inquiry, we'll reassess your future in the division. Olivia Fletcher smiled. It was a full human smile, the kind that showed teeth, and something about the sight of it made Kelvin's carapace contract. Thank you, sir. You won't regret this. He watched her walk out of his office and knew, with absolute certainty, that he would. 3 days later, she reported to Monster Division headquarters on Station Gamma 9. The facility was built to contain things that shouldn't exist: reinforced bulkheads, layered atmospheric security, containment protocols for species, ranging from rogue artificial intelligences to psychic predators who could rewrite memory on contact. Even the air inside felt different, recycled, sterile, charged with the invisible tension of a place that had seen too many things that couldn't be unseen. Olivia arrived early. She always arrived early. 6 years of dispatch had burned punctuality into her bones, and tardiness was how you lost trust before. You'd earned it, and trust, in her experience, was the only currency that actually mattered when things went wrong. She found conference room 7 and chose a chair scaled for human proportions, set her bag down and waited. Her new teammates arrived together, mid-conversation in a tangle of languages and body signals that her translator rendered imperfectly. 5 of them. She cataloged them the way she'd cataloged every person who ever walked into a crisis call. Quickly, quietly, without letting them know she was doing it. First through the door, Gorath Vraxian, 8 feet of deep purple, muscle, wearing the kind of face that had once made entire planetary populations reconsider their life choices. He looked at her, then looked at the chair she was sitting in, and made a sound the translator labeled as contemptuous amusement. She filed that away. Behind him came Tix and Vex, a pair of Keldrathi scouts, whose insectoid bodies moved in eerie unison, compound eyes sweeping the room, with the calm efficiency of beings who had never once walked into an environment they couldn't read. They studied her with something that might have been curiosity, might have been concern, hard to tell through the mandibulas. Priya entered next, Silvathi, serpentine, beautiful in a way that was also deeply unsettling, her scales cycling through greens and blues like sunlight through a tide pool. Toxicologist and infiltration specialist. She nodded at Olivia without a word. Olivia nodded back. And finally Commander Rex. He filled the doorway the way a warning fills a room, completely, immediately, leaving no space for anything else. Thoraxian, bipedal, but built like the universe's final answer to the question of what apex predation looked like at its most evolved. Gray-mottled fur, claws capable of shearing metal, eyes the color of a dying star. 10,000 years of his species perfecting. The hunt was visible in every angle of his body. He looked at Olivia the way a mountain looks at a sparrow. Fletcher, he said. Human resources. Former human resources, she replied evenly. Current Team 17. The silence that followed was the kind that asked a question without using words. Do you know where you are? Do you understand what you've walked into? She held his gaze and let the silence answer for her. Rex turned away first. Whether that was dismissal or assessment, she couldn't tell yet. She intended to find out. The briefing was straightforward. Team 17 handled the lower-tier caseload. The assignments deemed too minor for the division's senior hunters. Missing persons with extraterrestrial complications, small-scale smuggling operations, containment breaches at the lower security facilities. What it didn't say, but what Olivia read between every line, was that Team 17 was also where the division parked people it wasn't sure what to do with, where things got sent to be quietly sidelined or quietly proven wrong. She smiled to herself and thought of Detroit. She'd grown up in a city that had been written off 100 times and kept refusing to agree. She knew exactly what it felt like to be underestimated by people with clipboards and statistics, and she knew exactly what it felt like to prove them wrong. The first 3 assignments were unremarkable by Monster Division standards, which meant they were the most intense professional experiences of Olivia's life up to that point. A rogue bioform containment breach that required navigating corridors flooded with corrosive atmosphere, a black market weapons cache guarded by a Vraxian enforcer who changed his mind about resisting when Olivia spent 20 minutes calmly explaining to him, through the door, exactly what his post-conviction career options looked like. A missing persons case that turned out to involve an accidental dimensional fold in the lower station levels and resolved when Olivia noticed the fold's activation pattern matched the rhythm of a faulty atmospheric recycler and convinced the maintenance team to adjust the cycle frequency. After the 5th, Tix and Vex began including her in their pre-mission environment scans without being asked. After the 7th, Priya taught her 3 words in Solvati that roughly translated to "We've got your back." Rex said nothing, but he stopped positioning himself between her and exits during briefings, which she had quietly noticed he'd done for the first 2 weeks. In the language of Thoraxian body posture, that was practically a speech, and then on a cold cycle deep in the outer station sectors everything changed. The call came in at 0300 hours. A Novarian smuggler, registered alias Slicks, real identity still unconfirmed, and had been tracked to the loading bays of Terminus Station with a cargo that had just tripped every automated biosecurity flag in the sector simultaneously. The preliminary scan report was 4 words that stripped the warmth from the room the moment Rex read them aloud. Confirmed bioweapon. Class 1. 56 containers. Enough aerosolized pathogen to collapse the biological systems of every living being on the station within minutes of release. Enough to render the sector uninhabitable for a generation. And 1 smuggler with his hand close. Enough to a trigger that the margin for error was effectively 0. Team 17 was the closest unit. Protocol was clear. Wait for backup, establish a perimeter, contain the situation until specialist units arrived. Rex looked at the deployment timeline. Nearest specialist unit 47 minutes. He looked at the atmospheric containment report. Current integrity holding. Projected integrity at current deterioration rate, 31 minutes. He looked at his team. We go now, he said. And that was when Olivia Fletcher looked at the mission schematic, at the layout of the loading bays, at the psychological profile of an Novarian smuggler, backed into a corner, and felt the familiar cold clarity of a dispatcher who had seen this exact shape before, even if the details had always been different. She knew what this was. This wasn't a combat situation. This was a hostage negotiation, and that was the one thing on this team that she could do better than any of them. Rex, she said quietly as they moved toward the bay. When we get there, let me talk first. The Thoraxian commander looked at her for a long moment. Yellow eyes. Ancient, predatory, calculating. Then he nodded. One short, sharp, irreversible nod. The kind that means this is on you now. And Olivia Fletcher, former emergency dispatcher, former human resources administrator, walked toward a room containing 56 containers of species-ending bioweapon, armed with nothing but the thing she'd always been best at. Her voice, her mind, and the absolute refusal to accept that there was no way out. The loading bay smelled like metal and fear. Slicks had chosen his position well, centered between the containers, angled toward every entrance. A control panel within arm's reach. His pale Novarian skin had taken on the faint luminescent sheen his species showed under stress, and his eyes moved with the rapid, darting calculation of a being who had spent a lifetime reading exits. He was cornered and he knew it, which made him, in Olivia's experience, the most dangerous version of himself. The team had spread to the entry points. Rex in shadow near the main door. Priya coiling through a ventilation path overhead. Gorith was already down. She'd seen the evidence on the way in, a smear of purple-black on the corridor wall. Vraxian blood still fresh. She didn't have time to feel it. She filed it away and kept moving. She walked into the bay alone. Slicks's arm shot toward the control panel. Not another step. I'm not a hunter, Olivia said. Her voice was the voice she'd trained herself to have in Detroit. Not loud, not soft, not urgent, level. The voice of someone who believed completely that this situation was manageable. Because the second you stopped believing that, the person on the other end stopped believing it too, and then everything fell apart. The arm didn't lower, but it didn't reach the panel. She kept walking, slowly, no weapon drawn. Nothing in her hands but the kind of deliberate calm that takes years to build and can't be faked. I'm the administrator, she continued. The one they sent in to assess whether there's a deal to be made here. Because right now you're holding the most expensive cargo in this sector, and my employers want to know if you're actually a businessman, or if you're just here to die surrounded by it. The luminescent sheen on Slick's skin shifted. His eyes stopped darting and fixed on her. That was the first hook. She set the second. Whatever price you've been offered, she said, stopping just close enough to be a conversation, and far enough to give him breathing room. It's less than what this cargo is actually worth on the open market. I'm here because someone with significantly more credits than your current buyer wants to know if you're interested in a better conversation. Silence. Then, who? Someone who doesn't give names at this stage. That's how they've stayed operational. For as long as they have. She met his eyes, steady, unhurried. You know how this works, he knew. She could see it. The recalibration happening behind his expression. The shift from cornered to negotiating. That shift was everything. Once someone started calculating the value of a deal, they stopped calculating the value of a trigger. How much? He said. She didn't blink. 20 million. Half now, half on delivery. Slick's jaw worked. The number was real enough to be plausible, big enough to be interesting. She watched. The greed and the suspicion war behind his face and hoped greed was winning. Transfer to my account. I confirm receipt. Then we talk delivery coordinates. She turned slightly away, pulled out her communicator, and pressed it to her ear with the unhurried confidence of someone whose bluff is the truth. She murmured into it. Paused. Frowned slightly. A buyer's frown. Not a hunter's frown. Negotiated down from an invented objection. Accepted an imaginary counteroffer. Then she turned back. Agreed. Transfer incoming. The silence that followed was the longest 17 seconds of her life. She could feel the sweat at the base of her spine. Could hear the blood in her own ears. Somewhere above her, Priya was waiting. Somewhere in the shadows at the door, Rex was watching. She was standing in a room with enough weaponized pathogen to kill every living thing on the station, running a bluff with no cards left to play, buying time for a backup that existed on the mission schematic but not yet in the room. And then, before Slicks could check his account, before the fiction could unravel, Rex's voice filled the bay like a thunderclap. Or you could surrender now. And live. The Thoraxian stood in the main entrance, battered. A long gash across his shoulder not quite sealed. Weapons raised. Priya materialized from the ceiling like a shadow given form. Gorath, against every law of physics and blood loss, came through a side door flanked by ticks and vex. The warehouse was surrounded from every angle. For one perfect, breathless second, it was over. Then Slick's hand hit the control panel. Every container in the bay lit red. The sound it made was quiet, almost polite. A single soft tone like a clock chiming the hour before a building comes down. Nobody moves. His voice had gone flat and distant, the voice of someone who had already made peace with the worst version of what happened next. Release sequence initiated. 60 seconds to atmospheric dispersal. Everyone on this station dies within minutes. His luminescent skin pulsed. Something almost like calm settling over his features. My species evolved in toxic environments. I'll last hours. Long enough to reach my ship. Back away and let me leave, or we all find out what dissolved organs feel like. The temperature in the room felt like it dropped 10 degrees. Rex's ears flattened against his skull. Priya's scales shifted to a sickly, washed-out yellow. Olivia watched the calculation move through her team like a cold current. The grim arithmetic of a situation that had no clean exit. They were apex hunters, every one of them. Warriors built by evolution and training and 10,000 years of instinct. But even apex hunters recognized a wall when they ran into one. Her mind went very quiet. 6 years of dispatch. Hundreds of calls. Dozens of moments where the person on the other end had said something that translated in every language to the same thing: I have nothing left to lose. Where every protocol said there was no de-escalation path, no resolution, no outcome that didn't end in something terrible. She had found a third option every single time. She found one now. You're right, she said. Slicks looked at her. So did her team. You'll survive longer than us. She kept her voice completely level. The way you keep a flame level in a wind, through deliberate and conscious effort, not through the absence of the wind. But you're wrong about the ship. A pause. Just long enough to let curiosity do its work. Commander Rex. She still didn't look away from Slicks. Standard bioweapon protocol. What happens to the airlocks the moment dispersal is confirmed? Rex understood immediately. His voice didn't waver. Full station lockdown. All airlocks seal automatically. No launch windows. Any departure attempt triggers automated defense systems. Lethal response. No override. So? Olivia took one slow step forward. You'll outlast us. That part is true. You'll have hours while we have minutes. But you won't have a ship. You won't have an exit. You'll be sealed. Inside a station with your own weapons dispersal pattern slowly, working through the atmosphere, outliving everyone by just long enough to understand that no one is coming and there is no way out. She let that image sit for a moment. How does that story end, Slicks? Because I've seen that story before. I've taken those calls, and I have never once, not one single time, seen that version end with the person walking away. The countdown pulsed in the red light above the containers. 53 seconds, 52. She didn't look at it. Looking at it would tell him it scared her. It did scare her. That was irrelevant. There is another version, she said, quieter now. Almost gentle. You stop the sequence. You face a tribunal. You spend time in custody, and I'm not going to pretend that's a good future. Because it isn't, but it is a future. Maybe you cooperate. Maybe you reduce your sentence. Maybe in 10 years you're standing somewhere completely different, starting over. That version of you is alive. That version of you still has options. She held his gaze without flinching. The other version is a cautionary briefing. A file photo, a number in a casualty report that no one reads twice. Another step forward. Which one do you want to be? 50 seconds, 49. The red light painted everything in the bay the color of emergency. The color of the last moment before something goes permanently wrong. Slick's hand was trembling. She could see him running the math. She'd watched people run this exact calculation 100 times across a dispatch board, then the moment where survival instinct fights with pride, where the brain finally accepts that the exit it wanted doesn't exist and starts looking for the one that does. He was a survivor, not an ideologue, not a martyr, a smuggler who had stayed alive for years through flexibility and calculation and the willingness to adapt when the situation demanded it. She was offering him something to adapt toward. The hand moved away from the panel. The countdown stopped. The red lights went dark. The bay returned to its normal color, pale, industrial, ordinary, and for a moment it looked so mundane that Olivia almost couldn't believe what had just happened in it. She exhaled, the quietest exhale of her life, barely more than a breath, controlled even now, because she didn't want anyone in the room to see how close she had just come to the absolute edge of what she could hold together. Gorth crossed the bay in 3 strides and moving with shocking speed for a being his size, even injured, and had Slicks restrained before the Novarian's expression had finished changing. Priya dropped from the ceiling to secure the secondary suspect. Tix and Vex moved to the containers with the careful, reverent focus of specialists who understood precisely what they were handling. Rex came to stand beside her. He was quiet for a moment. Those ancient yellow eyes moved over her face the way a scanner moves over a surface it hasn't seen before, and slowly, thoroughly, like it's looking for something it didn't expect to find. Then he said, in 40 cycles of field operations, I have never seen anything like that. It's what I did in Detroit, Olivia said. Her knees, she noticed distantly, were shaking. The adrenaline was still holding her upright, but it was making promises it wouldn't be able to keep for much longer. Find the option they haven't considered. Give them a reason to want to be alive tomorrow. You could have died. Yes. You knew that going in. Yes. Another silence. Then something shifted in Rex's face, and not warmth exactly. Thoraxians weren't architecturally built for warmth, but something that lived in the same territory. The look of a predator encountering something it hadn't known how to classify before, and finally finding the category. Welcome to the monster division, he said. Not the provisional version. The real one. 6 months later, Olivia stood in Kelvin Thra's office for the second time. The recruitment officer looked exactly the same as he had at their first meeting, except for one thing. The expression on his face. Last time he had been performing patience at someone he fully expected to fail quietly and disappear. Now he was reading her file. The way you read something you already know but still can't quite make yourself believe. 12 operations, he said. 7 high-value captures. 0 team casualties. He set the slate down. Commander, Rex's assessment uses the word extraordinary 4 times. He's formally requesting your promotion to full agent status and authorization to form your own unit. I'd heard something to that effect, sir. Kelvin studied her with all 4 of his eyes, the full attention look, the kind he reserved for things that genuinely required recalibration. I approved your transfer because something told me you might survive, he said finally. I want to be honest with you. I did not expect this. Neither did most of my team, initially. What you did at Terminus Station. He shook his head slowly. The negotiation. The psychological architecture of it. Walking in there alone with no weapon. And no backup and talking a cornered smuggler. Away from a trigger that would have ended thousands of lives. That wasn't in any training manual I've ever read. No, sir, she met his eyes. It was in 6 years of working a dispatch board in a city that didn't have a manual for most of what happened there. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that means something is being genuinely reconsidered. Then he pushed a data chip across the desk. Team 42, he said. They handle the cases that don't fit standard categories. Criminals too unpredictable for conventional tactics. Threats that don't respond to force. Situations that require someone who can look at an impossible problem and find the exit. No one else noticed. He paused. I imagine you'll find it familiar. Olivia picked up the chip, felt its weight in her palm, thought about a city that had been written off 100 times, thought about 56 red lights, going dark in a loading bay on the word of a woman with no weapon, and no backup and no plan beyond the next sentence. Thought about a Thoraxian commander who had nodded once, sharply, and handed her the weight of thousands of lives. Thought about how she hadn't dropped it. One more thing. Fletcher. Kelvin's mandibles clicked, the sound she had learned, over 6 months and 12 operations, to recognize as his version of laughter. The buyer, the 20 million credit transfer, the encrypted channel, all of it. Yes, sir. You had nothing, no buyer, no account, no contingency, completely improvised from start to finish. Correct. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, absolutely terrifying, he waved her toward the door. Dismissed, Agent Fletcher. Try not to give your new team a collective cardiac event within the first week. She walked out of his office, down the corridor, through the halls of a place that had once looked at her like an open question and now looked at her like an answer it hadn't known it needed. She was not the strongest thing in these halls. Not the fastest, not the most heavily armed, not the most durable. She had no claws, no venom, no millennia of apex predator instinct running through her blood like inherited fire. What she had was the thing that Detroit had built in her. Quietly. Over 6 years of impossible calls and impossible situations and the stubborn, grinding refusal to accept that impossible meant unsolvable. The ability to walk into a room that had no exit and find one. The capacity to look at a mind under pressure and see not what it was doing but what it wanted, and to offer it something worth wanting that didn't involve everyone dying. And the willingness to do all of that while standing in the middle of it alone, holding it all together through nothing but the steadiness of her own voice. The galaxy was full of monsters. And somewhere, between a transfer application that made a veteran officer laugh out loud and a 60-second countdown, she had stopped with words alone. Olivia Fletcher had learned something. Those monsters were still in the process of figuring out. The most dangerous predator in any room is rarely the one that looks dangerous. Sometimes it's the one in the sensible shoes, with the calm voice and the dark eyes that don't blink quite as often as they should, who walks toward you when every survival instinct in your biology is screaming that she should be running away. She found the briefing room for Team 42, squared her shoulders, opened the door. Whatever was waiting inside she had handled worse. After all, she'd spent 6 years taking calls in Detroit. How much stranger could the monsters possibly get?